I'm Kelly Grizzle, and I'm an architect at SailPoint. I've been, like Brian said, I've been involved with the SCIM spec for quite a while. I've been in the identity management industry or systems management industry for, probably going on a dozen years or so. So I'm kind of well seasoned and well versed in a lot of the stuff, kind of more steeped in it than I would like to be at some points, but I've been around it for a while. Today we're going to be talking about SCIM. If you're here looking for family swim time, you have come to the wrong room, so turn around and leave, because this will bore you to death. So real quick before we get going, I've got a lot of content here, and I want to make sure that I aim this presentation at the right level. So this isn't a rhetorical question. I'd like to see like a show of hands if you have ever heard of SCIM or kind of know what SCIM is about at a high level. Okay, cool. So we can breeze through the intro stuff pretty quick. Okay, so next question. There is kind of two classifications of people. You have your nerds and your businessy people. Like the nerds are the boots on the ground that are installing software and making sure that the infrastructure works. And then you have the business people that are in charge of telling the nerds what to do and coming up with this grand scheme. So if you're a nerd, can you raise your hand? They're not mutually exclusive, by the way. Okay, quite a few nerds here, unsurprisingly. Okay, and any businessy people? Okay, good amount there too. All right, now last question. Has anybody started using SCIM yet or have plans to use SCIM? All right, good deal. Well, hopefully this will be interesting to you then. Awesome. Well, let's get going then. So what we're going to talk about today is an overview of SCIM. What is it? We're going to talk about the importance of it and how it's just becoming more important all the time. We're going to go over some use cases and talk about how it's being used. We'll get into a deeper dive that's sort of the gory details, a lot like what Brian was showing. You're going to see the real JSON, the real HTTP stuff happening, so you can get a feel for that. And then we're going to talk about how simple is SCIM and talk about ways that if you're planning on implementing SCIM to make use of some of the tools that are out there and how quickly you can get ramped up on that. So what is SCIM? SCIM is the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. And so kind of the last part of that is the most important. It's about managing identities, creating, reading, updating, deleting. It's cross-domain, meaning that you are getting identities from here to there, right? You're going across domain boundaries. And system is just kind of a throwaway word so that we can come up with a cool SCIM acronym. And yes, it is also simple. If anybody has been following SCIM for a while, you'll know that the acronym used to stand for Simple Cloud Identity Management. We still think it's simple, but it's not just relegated to the cloud anymore. It's got use cases beyond that, so the name got changed along the way. So, what is SCIM? SCIM is a standard that it defines a protocol and a schema for identity management. And the schema has core representations for users and groups. You guys are all identity nerds or business people, so you're well steeped in this, right? There's identities, there's groups, authorization that goes along with that. It has representations for those. Those are in the JSON format, JavaScript object notation. It's really commonly used these days. It's extremely easy to parse and read and understand, so it's kind of the flavor of the week with standards. And it's extensible. We'll spend some more time talking about that later, but we know that everybody's identities look a little bit different. You might, at your company, you may have some additional attributes that are interesting to you about the people that you manage that are completely uninteresting for me. So it's extensible, so you can take that core and build out from it. The protocol is REST-based. Representational state transfer. You've probably heard of it. It's used very commonly in APIs these days. It's built on HTTP, and we'll get into some of the guts of that later. And it's aimed around doing creation, reading, updating, deleting. There's search functionality. There's discovery, so you can ask the server the types of things that are supported. And there's bulk operations as well, so that you can import a lot of identities at once, for example. So at a high level, this is how I see the identity protocol landscape. Some of the key players out there. There's, I'm sure, sessions on all of these that you're going to attend this week. And you have SCIM, OpenID Connect, SAML, OAuth. And this is roughly how I see them broken down, right? SCIM is more in the provisioning and identity management business for doing that creating, reading, updating type operations. OpenID Connect and SAML are primarily geared towards authentication to enable SSO, federation, those sorts of use cases. And OAuth is for your authorization. Some of these other standards will utilize OAuth, and it's very useful. But that's, at a high level, zooming out 10,000 feet, that's how I see things. So what sort of problems does SCIM solve? Like I said, it's all about identity management. You have a system, you have your environment, you have a bunch of identities in your environment, you have a bunch of connected applications that you're managing that have identities as well, and you need to be able to create identities between those. You need to be able to update identities, get rid of them when a user gets terminated. You need to be able to manage access, often through group management. And so those are sort of the sweet spot for SCIM. All right, so nerds, this slide is for you. A quick example, we're going to go on and talk some more businessy stuff here in a minute, but a quick example just because I speak code better than I speak business. So this is a SCIM request. It's a REST call. It's an HTTP call. You see that there's a post that to the user's endpoint. This is to create a new user. It's sending it to example.com. It's saying that I'm going to send you JSON and I want JSON back. It's using an OAuth bearer token to perform its authentication and authorization. And down below you see the JSON format for a user. That's a real minimal user, Barbara Jensen, who will appear later in our slides again. So where does SCIM come from, and where is it going to? SCIM was founded about 4 years ago, actually, at this very conference. Back in 2010, some like-minded individuals came together and realized that we sort of needed a identity management protocol, a standard identity management protocol. There's a bunch of identity management protocols out there. Almost every service and SaaS provider has their own, and that's kind of the problem right there. Everybody has their own, so we wanted to come up with a standard one. It was conceived about 4 years ago. Not a lot of work happened for the first year, but around May 2011, we really kicked off work under the Open Web Foundation, and that's kind of a loose standardsing body that's like, hey, if we could be friends and kind of roughly agree on things and we're all happy. So it's a good way to get a spec sort of launched and off the ground. So we did that, and later that year, 7 months later, in December 2011, we came out with the SCIM 1.0 spec and continued working on it. We decided at that point that we wanted some more help from a standards body that could provide a little more rigor around the process, get some more eyes on the specs, things like that. And so we took it to the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, that's done a whole lot of HTTP things, and they have their hands in tons of these sorts of things. And so we took it there and we formed a working group. Summer of 2012, we released SCIM 1.1 under the OWF. That was our last OWF release, and that's kind of the current release that most people are using right now. And for the last couple of years, we've been working hard on SCIM 2.0, which, as a matter of fact, this week we're having a meeting up in Toronto, an IETF meeting, and we're going to try to move the documents close to working group last call, which means that we're getting near the very end, kind of have a little bit of work to get our I's dotted and our T's crossed, but most of the content is there for us. So expect that to happen later on this year. Okay, so there's your overview. What is SCIM? Now we're going to talk about why SCIM is important, and hopefully this resonates with some of you business heads out there and some of you IT heads too. This is kind of what a typical enterprise environment might look like, right? You have a bunch of applications that are in your enterprise doing a bunch of different things. Some of them are on-premises, some of them are SaaS applications up in the cloud. On-prem, you might have an Active Directory that holds a bunch of your users in a directory. It manages your network access, et cetera. You might have an Oracle database that is sort of a data warehouse that houses data for other apps that you use, some custom apps down there. Those are those black boxes. You have custom apps, Unix boxes, things like that. And then you've got some cloud services as well that are outside of your firewall. You might use Office 365 for mail, Workday for your HR, Salesforce.com for managing your sales and client relationships. And as you guys know, every single one of these systems has to deal with identity, right? Identity is incredibly important. We all have identities. We're wearing them around our necks here. They kind of describe who we are, what we can do. And so every one of these systems has an identity, but they're all you. There may be some specific information about you in Office 365 per se, your mailbox quota or something like that, but they all need to be tied together. And so this turns into the spider webby kind of problem. You've got identities that a lot of the information is really the same, and it needs to get spread among these systems that you're managing. Often there's an identity management system, either one that you bought or one that's homegrown, kind of in the middle of this, managing these interactions. But you can tell it gets pretty ugly. So, and that's kind of your typical case, and it's extremely painful. Part of the pain comes from the complexity of it. You have the on-prem and the off-prem things that you have to manage. Part of that comes from the fact that every system has to deal with identity. And they're not unique identities. They're identities that are all you, that all have similar information that needs to go between the systems. And often it's not just a one-way synchronization, say sending from Active Directory up to Salesforce.com, but you have two-way things, like your HR tool is going to need to write things back into Active Directory, your job title and things like that. And also there's authorization that's involved. Often it's externalized. You might have a system like Active Directory that you're using groups to manage the authorization throughout your enterprise, and you might want those rules to flow throughout your system as well. Other things that can make this very painful that come into play often are mergers and acquisitions. If you're part of a big company, you may have had to deal with this, but you've got two sets of people, you have two sets of applications, and they're trying to become one, right? And so all of a sudden, you've got a dozen more applications that you need to try to manage. You need to get these users integrated into your environment. And it needs to happen fast because M&A, you need to get systems running so people can be productive again. There's also this phenomenon from the past 5 years or so since SaaS vendors have really started coming up in prominence called bring your own application. And the idea here is that SaaS has been awesome. It's really brought a lot of efficiency to organizations. It's brought a lot of tools to organizations that they can use, but they're so easy to get now. You can often go to a SaaS provider, give them a credit card number, and you're signed up for their service, and you're using it. IT may not even know that your division in the organization is using that, and that can be a pretty big problem, especially when an employee leaves your company, right? Because if IT doesn't know about that you're even using the system, an employee leaves your company, how do you get rid of that access? And that's what leads to some of these security breaches and things like that are in the news all the time. And there's also mobile. That's sort of a special case of bring your own app, but people are using mobile apps like crazy these days. They often, almost always have to deal with identity, and so getting that integrated in as well. So here are some of the ways that these problems are addressed today, and they're all, in my view, pretty insufficient. The common way, the lowest bar is manual entry, hand entry, and You might have done this when you went and signed up for the Cloud Identity Summit, right? You go to the website, you type in your information, and you have an identity there, right? And then they can print out your badge when you show up at the registration booth. Problems with that in the enterprise is that there's a lot of latency involved, it's error prone, it's labor intensive, and just like I was saying before, if somebody leaves the organization, somebody has to go and remember to disable or delete that account. So that one's kind of fraught with peril right there, and it doesn't scale up to large organizations. There's also bulk upload, where you have a spreadsheet or a CSV or something of user information, and you send it all up into your application. It's often used sort of as a bootstrapping process. Lots of times just a one-off sort of thing to get the initial set of users into your system. But it's often slow. It doesn't catch all the changes that need to go also, and it takes manual intervention as well. The most common and probably the closest to what we're looking for to really solve the problem is APIs and connectors. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of these out there right now. Almost every SaaS provider has an API, maybe a REST API, maybe a SOAP API, maybe they've got an API written in Java or whatever language that you're using to be able to connect into their system to manage identities. The problem with these is that if you deal with, say, a dozen different applications, you're having to deal with a dozen different APIs. And if one of those APIs gets upgraded, then that thing's broken. You got to go fix it. And it becomes very costly to deal with, especially with some of these problems that we talked about, like the mergers and acquisitions, the bring your own application, those sorts of things. It's impossible to keep up with the change there. And there's also SAML, just-in-time provisioning. That's, if you're not aware of it, it's if you do a single sign-on with SAML and you don't have an account on the system yet, you can do a just-in-time provisioning often that will create your identity in that system with the information that's provided in the SAML request. And it's good for if in some cases, but it has some things that fall down too. Again, there's no deprovisioning through that. You can't get rid of the user when they leave the company. And there's no pre-provisioning either. So try to do that like on Office 365. It's not going to work. You need people to be able to get email before they log into their system, right? So. And then there's SCIM. And so we kind of looked at those problems on the last slide, with the state of affairs as they stood, and decided that we needed something to address that. And so SCIM is a lower cost to develop. There's a consistent API that's used. There's open source tools out there to do it. You kind of write it once and can reuse it on a lot of your systems, and so it scales up very well. It doesn't have the problem of leaving kind of orphaned identities out there when somebody leaves your company. So hopefully if you're doing things right, you won't show up in the national news and your CEO sitting in front of a congressional panel explaining why your passwords were leaked everywhere. And it's real time. You don't have to wait for manual intervention. It just flows through the system immediately. So obviously, I'm pretty up on SCIM. I like it. I think it's good, but I'm not the only one out there who likes it. There's a number of people who've been involved with SCIM, either through helping to write the spec, to provide comments on the spec, to start implementations, and here's just a list of some of them. This is not all of them out there. You see some identity providers out there, like Ping, like SailPoint, the company that I work for, and you see some SaaS providers up there too, people like Salesforce.com, Cisco, those type of people. So it's gained a lot of traction, and we hope to see it just keep growing and growing going forward. Okay, so now you know what SCIM is, and you know why it's so important. Let's go over some of the use cases about how SCIM is being used out there. The first one is a little bit of a surprise to me, or it was initially, but now that I think about it more, it's not so surprising, is that it's not just being used for cloud applications. It's being used a lot within an organization internally. No cloud at all, so really changing the name to cross-domain wasn't such a bad idea after all. Because people that just have applications on premises are facing these same problems, right? They have that exact same problem of getting an identity from here to there, having a common language to describe what an identity is. And so they've actually picked up on SCIM and started implementing it themselves internally. Interesting use case from last year. I was up in Napa at the Cloud Identity Summit, and a guy came up to me and started talking to me about SCIM, and he was all jazzed and real excited about it. And he said he wanted to tell me what they were doing with it. He works for a big company. They've got a ton of connected systems. They've got somewhere upwards of 3,500 systems that they manage in their IT department, and tons of employees that they have to manage. And he said, you know, it's gotten to be so painful to keep up with this system that we're just kind of throwing down the gauntlet, and we're saying, we can't keep up with this anymore. All these systems that you guys are bringing in, all these BYOA things that you guys are doing, we can't keep up with the pace of pulling this into our infrastructure. So he kind of made a deal with the organization. He said, if you bring an app in that can speak SCIM, then we'll take care of it. It'll get plugged in. We'll do the legwork, the little bit of legwork it takes to plug it in. If you don't, then you get to write the connector for it to get it plugged into our environment. And I heard it last year at CIS, and it was crazy. Within the next couple months or so, I heard of five or six other cases of people doing this in their organizations. So it's actually probably the most common use of SCIM now, and it was, I think, really probably the first real-world adoption of SCIM that we saw people actually using it in a live environment. So here's a picture of that. It's, you know, the stuff behind your firewall. You have your Active Directory, your data warehouse, all your apps behind the firewall needing to talk together. That's your enterprise case. So not surprisingly, SCIM is also being used in the cloud. We've seen, as you saw on that slide earlier with the wall of logos, like what I like to call it, it's being adopted by a bunch of SaaS providers now. They're picking it up and starting to create SCIM interfaces that clients can use to create and manage their identities. So here's what that looks like from our picture. You have your on-premise stuff. You might have an identity management system in play down there that's sort of driving the life cycle and interactions between these systems. And some of them are talking SCIM. The blue here on the right side, WebEx, Salesforce, those are both SCIM enabled. Here on the other side, you have things that are not SCIM enabled yet. You have SOAP, you have other REST protocols, you have custom connectors and things like that. And so really, our vision is to see the blue take over there, right? You start getting more blue, and it becomes a lot easier for you to start managing all the systems that you have. Another interesting case that I'll just briefly mention is, you may have heard of this before. I think there was a talk at last year's Cloud Identity Summit about this. It's called a Cloud Identity Bridge. And the idea here is that you have something that lives up in the cloud, like an identity management provider, and it needs to be able to talk to systems that live behind your firewall, that are on premises, right? That's a problem because there's some security issues of going through a firewall. You have the spread out infrastructure where you might have dozens of ports that you have to open up and things like that. So there's this notion of a cloud identity bridge where you have a single point in your firewall that you can put this identity bridge. It can talk SCIM on the top end of it, so your cloud service provider can talk down to it, and then it can fan that out to different APIs behind your firewall. Here's a picture of that. So you've got a cloud service provider up there doing some sorts of identity management, needing to transfer identity information behind your firewall. You have an extremely secure SCIM bridge there in the middle that you can lock down really tightly and have a single language that the cloud talks to it through, and it fans out to the native APIs down there, LDAP or JDBC or whatever it is. Or if you have SCIM-enabled apps down there, it can talk SCIM also. And it can talk to SCIM-enabled things up in the cloud. Right, so there's our use cases. Now this is the point in the presentation when the nerds get excited and the business people sort of glaze over a little bit. I saw a lot of nerds' hands raised though, so we'll stick with it for a little bit. We're going to get into some of the gory details about the schema, the protocol, and how you extend SCIM. So, first off, let's talk about schema. Schema is just a way that you represent objects, right? It is what defines an entity. In SCIM, there's a couple of core schemas that come in the SCIM spec. We have one for users, and we have one for groups. And those have JSON representations. We saw that example earlier of Barbara Jensen, of what that might look like. And like I said, it's extensible. We know that as a SCIM author, I know that I can't possibly think of every use case and every attribute that somebody's going to need to write. And it would be dumb to try to do that, right? It just would paint you into a corner. And so SCIM was built with extensibility sort of at the core of it. We try to handle the common 80% within the schema, but we make it possible to extend the schema. So you can extend an existing resource type. This is extremely common for service providers to do. They have a little bit of additional information that is really important to them that they need to keep about your identity, your mailbox quota in Office 365, for example, things like that. And so it's very common to extend an existing resource. That would be extending a user to add some more information. You can also create a brand new resource type. And so a lot of times, these service providers have resource types that are sometimes identity related, like roles. You know, what role do you fit in your organization? They've got entire data models built around those. Sometimes they're not identity related at all. You know, you might have information about the clusters that you can manage or something like that. But SCIM is so flexible that it can model identity information or non-identity information. It's really up to the provider about what they want to provide for that. There's a JSON format that describes a schema. So this is a way in a JSON document to say that this is what I think an identity is. It has a first name, a last name, an email address, a set of phone numbers, things like that, right? So there's a JSON format for that you can interchange and you can discover. And there's a set of standard data types that you can use to build those schemas with. Things like strings, dates, numbers, and references between objects so that you can say, for instance, in our enterprise user in the core SCIM schema, there's a reference to another user that is your manager. And so there's references between different objects in a SCIM system. All right, so down to the nuts and bolts here. Here's an example of a user. This is a little bit richer than the Barbara Jensen that we showed before. You have, up at the very top, you have a schemas element, and that declares what schemas are supported or are being used in this JSON document. This particular one is just using the SCIM core user schema. So it's using attributes just from the SCIM core user schema, no extensions. There is an ID. Every object in SCIM has an identifier. This is service provider managed, and it's completely unique within their system. There's an external ID that can say who you are on your local system. You have meta information, metadata about the user or about whatever object that you're dealing with. One piece of that is a resource type that says what endpoint did this object come from? Did it come from the users endpoint? Did it come from the /groups endpoint? Information about when it was created, updated, where you can find it again. There's a version tag that you can use for kind of concurrency checking. That's an optional feature. There's complex attributes, so you can have sort of a bag of attributes stuffed together, like the name there. There's a number of sub-attributes underneath name. Simple attributes, username is just a string. Barbara B. Jensen is just a string. And then multi-valued attributes as well. And this multi-valued attribute has multiple values. I ran out of room, so there's actually one value in this multi-valued attribute, but it would be a list of phone numbers. And they don't just have to be simple types in those multi-valued attributes. You can have complex types. For instance, a phone number, you might have one phone number for work and one phone number for home. And so those are sort of units that fit within that phone numbers list. So we talked about extensions. Let's look really quickly at what that looks like. This is an example of an extended user using the enterprise user schema. You see the same user schema, the 2.0 user schema that we had before. In addition to that, there is the SCIM core enterprise user schema. So we're declaring up at the top that we're using both the core user schema and the enterprise user schema. And down below, you see it being used. That's done with a JSON attribute. You give the name of the schema that you're using, and everything that falls underneath that are attributes that are specific to that schema. So for a enterprise user, you have things like employee number, the cost center that you're associated with. There's an instance of a manager, like I was mentioning before. A reference between two objects is pointing to another user in your system. So that's what an extension looks like for the schema. All right, let's dive deeper into the API now that we've seen what schema looks like. If you're familiar with REST at all, this is going to look extremely familiar to you. There's not any groundbreakingly new stuff here. If you're not familiar with REST, it's basically using standard HTTP to make a protocol work. It's using the verbs, the things that we call REST verbs, post, put, patch, get, delete, things like that to accomplish things on your system. And so SCIM makes use of those. There is a create operation that's done through an HTTP post. Interesting history on post. That verb actually came about back in the very, very early days of the internet, when most of what you had out there were message boards. And people would want to add a new message onto a message board, so they would post it. And so posting is like creating a new thing. They want to post a new message on that board. And that's where that name came from, which is, I just found that out. It's kind of cool to my nerdy brain. So. There's also reading. You just use a get operation to do that. You're getting a single user in this case. You can do a put that does an update. That's a full replacement of a user. So the JSON object that you send is going to fully replace the object on the server. That's different than patch down below there, which is another kind of update that does a partial update. You might just want to update a small piece of a user or of a group. This is really important when you have large objects that change a lot. For example, on groups, you have a member. There's a members list on our group object, and in some environments, those group memberships change, hundreds, thousands of times a day, and you don't want to be saying, "Here's my whole group with 10,000 members in it." You want to say, "Here's my group, and hey, I want you to add Kelly to that group, or I want you to remove Kelly from that group. He shouldn't be there anymore." And so it makes it a lot more succinct. Completely unoriginally, to do a delete, you use the delete verb. And SCIM also has a search or listing of objects. You can just list objects either with or without a filter. There's a filtering language that's, you can specify filter strings that's based on the Open Search protocol. It has index-based paging on it and sorting as well. So you can just get small pages of results rather than saying, "Give me all 100,000 users in the environment." Here's an example of that same create request that we saw earlier with Babs, Jensen. Just kind of pulling out a few of the resty parts here. It is a post operation, which is a creation, right? We're posting a new user to the user's endpoint. We want to create a new user. You have the content type and the accept that the formats that you're dealing with. In SCIM, this is always JSON. It used to, in SCIM 1.1, XML was supported also, but we thought, hey, that's not simple to have two different things that do the exact same thing. So we threw out XML because that flavor of the week got a little bit stale, I guess. So, and then down below you have your user payload. That's schema stuff that we were just looking at. And then with REST, after you make that call, you get a REST or an HTTP response back. HTTP has some built-in result codes. Some of them indicate success, some of them indicate failure, and like any good REST API, SCIM makes use of those to indicate how well your operation performed. And so in this case, we're saying that there's a 201 created status that we did actually create the user. A location is returned. That's got the permalink, the permanent link to that user that you just created. Since the unique identifier that the server generated is stable, that link is going to be valid for as long as that user is there. And then below in the create and in our update requests, like most REST APIs, the actual thing that was created gets sent back in the response body. And that's so that the client, I'm creating Barbara Jensen, I'm doing a post, I say I want to create Barbara Jensen, and the server is going to respond with some more information to me than what I sent. It's going to create that unique identifier and send it back to me. I probably want to store that on my system so I can reference her later, right? So it sends back what it had created. Let's talk for a minute about the discovery part of the API, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in the next section on extensibility as well. But the idea with SCIM is that a client can be completely ignorant of a server. It can come in not knowing anything about the server other than here's sort of the base URL that I want to hit, right? Here's my scim.example.com /v2 or something like that. And it can go and hit some discovery endpoints and learn everything it needs to know to use that server. So they're broken up into kind of two categories. The one down below is service provider configs. This is very similar to the root DSE on an LDAP server. It provides information about what the server supports. So it's going to give you things about is filtering supported, is patch supported, there's some optional things like bulk, is bulk supported, what sort of authentication schemes do you support? Out of the box, SCIM, we recommend to use OAuth bearer tokens for authentication, but a service provider can have whatever authentication they want there. It's extremely common for service providers to use basic HTTP authentication, where a username and password is encoded base64 and sent up. So it says what is supported, so a client can say, hey, it says that it handles OAuth bearer tokens, and I can do OAuth bearer tokens, so let's start doing that. Let's talk, right? Just your handshake. The next two pieces are kind of tied together for discovery, and it describes the types of objects that the server can manage. The first piece is the schemas endpoint. You can query the schemas endpoint, and it will give you information about every schema that the server knows about. So it's going to give you the core user schema. It's going to give you the core group schema. If you have schema extensions, those are going to show up there. If you have custom object types that you have schemas for, those are going to show up there. And so it lets you see when it makes a call to an endpoint what to expect to get back. And when it's creating things on an endpoint, it gives you information about, is this attribute required, or can I leave this off of this request? Is this attribute read-only? Should I not try to send this back? Things like that. There's also a resource types endpoint that's tied to the schemas endpoint. And what that one describes is every type of object that your server supports. So it has the endpoint at which you can query to get all those objects. It's like /users, /groups, things like that. It also has some information, a description, a name, and it says what schemas are used by that endpoint. So what schemas can I expect to get back when I'm querying on the user's table, or on the user's endpoint, and schema extensions. So that segues, yeah?
What you were talking about just now, is that covered in 1.1 or is that a 2.0?
This is, part of it is in 1.1 and part of it is in 2.0. So in 1.1, we didn't have a lot of exposure to people trying to implement this yet. We were interoping and testing as we went along, but we didn't have a lot of people trying to do extensions. And through the interop process, we found that there were some holes there, that you couldn't let a client just fully discover what it was trying to do. And so in 1.1, what you have is the schemas endpoint and the endpoint configs endpoint. You don't have the resource type endpoint, though. The resource type endpoint information, like the endpoint that you're hitting and things like that, in 1.1 is all buried within the schema itself. So it made it very hard to kind of share pieces of schema and to reuse and describe things like that. Thanks. Good question. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about extensions and how you might go about using these. So there's two ways, like I've mentioned. You can either extend an existing resource type or you can create a brand new resource type. The first one we're going to talk about is extending an existing type. Like I said before, the core objects that are in the SCIM spec were kind of aimed at supporting the common 80%, things that almost everybody is going to need to use. If there's things that we heard of that people said, oh, you should put this into the user schema, and only 20% of the population would be interested in that, or even 50% of the population, we said, no, let's either make that some common schema extension, or let's let a service provider come up with a custom schema extension. Almost every service provider uses these because that 80% is not enough for anybody, really. You need a little bit more to your identities than just what comes in the core. So it's extremely common, and it's really easy for service providers to do. In the 2.0 spec, the way that you do that is you create a new schema that has the extended attributes that you're trying to model, and then you modify your resource type to list out the schema extensions that resource type is using. And so we'll look at an example here. If you're like me, every conference you go to, you come home with a new t-shirt that you wear once at the conference and then you use for yard work later. Unless it's a CIS shirt that's black and you don't want to wear that out doing yard work in Austin because it's 100 degrees and you'll melt, basically. So here's an example, though, of it extending the user schema. This is a real simple extension. I called it Conference Goer, and it has a single extended attribute on it, your t-shirt size. Because wouldn't it be awesome if when you registered for this conference, you could say, I want this size t-shirt. So when they hand you your backpack, it's got your size t-shirt in it. I don't know. I kind of like seeing the kids run back and get excited about grabbing my size t-shirt. But if you could register and add a t-shirt size, then this is how you do it. All right, this is a shirt size attribute. It's a string. It's not multi-valued. What kind of conference doesn't come with a t-shirt these days? It's not required. If you don't want a t-shirt, that's fine. And then you extend the resource type. Here's our user's resource type. It's using the user's endpoint, saying that anytime you query from the user's endpoint or anytime you create in the user's endpoint, these are the schemas that you're dealing with. The one that's named schema, that's the primary schema that is always going to be returned by that endpoint. And for our core types, it's always going to be those core schemas that come out of the spec. And then you have a schema extensions multi-valued attribute down there that you list out the extended schemas that you want to support. And you can either require them, saying that, that this thing has to be given to me when a new user is created. You have to give me your t-shirt size. You have to have this extension. Or it can be not required. That's what that flag is for there. And that's a multi-valued list. So you can have a lot of those things, right?
Kelly, just really quick there.
Sure.
On that particular extension there, obviously there's more attributes in that particular schema conference goer that we sort of noticed, right? So some can be required, some are not required. Is there a balance that you need to do your decision making on how you set up your schema of what needs to be required and what may not be?
Yeah, it's really up to the service provider usually, because we came up with some defaults for the core SCIM schemas, but sometimes, Salesforce.com, for instance, they require, we're doing an interop this afternoon, by the way. There's like half a dozen SCIM people that have come together and are interoping our software and testing it out and stuff. But Salesforce.com is one of those. But for example, they require an external ID. They require that when you create the user. That's not required by the standard core user schema. So it's really up to the service provider. So that's why this introspection part is pretty important. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So you can also create a new resource type. And this would be if you want to add a new object that is not supported by the core SCIM schema, right? So you do this very similarly to if you're adding attributes to an existing resource. You create a new schema, and instead of updating an existing resource type, you add a new resource type. Really simple. So that's not as common, though, as extending existing resources. Here's a quick example of doing this. This one is a blog post. You have some attributes that define what a blog post is. You've got a title for your blog post. Does anyone blog anymore, or do we just tweet these days? I don't know. But this is truncated, but you might have other things. You have the content of the blog post. You might have a reference to a user in your system who's the author of that blog post. And then for your resource type, you create a brand new one of these guys. You say, I'm going to hit the /blog posts endpoint. I'm going to do a get to retrieve these things. I'm going to do a post to create a new blog post. And by the way, this thing uses the blog post schema. Pretty simple. So here's an example, real quick, of using one of those extended or a brand new resource type. You do a get on /blog post, and you get a blog post back. And so that's an example of using SCIM for something that is completely unrelated to identity, but you might want to do it. All right, so let's talk real quick, and I'm kind of running out of time here, but let's talk about how simple SCIM is. And here we're going to be focusing on if you're actually going to dive in, if you drank the Kool-Aid, if you see the pain that I've been talking about, if you think that SCIM is the answer, how do you get started looking into it? So SCIM has some core values that we've always developed it under. Simplicity has always been key. We want to make things simple for the client, especially because there's going to be more code written for clients than there are servers, but we want to make it pretty easy for servers as well. We want to solve real-world problems, as is evidenced by the use case scenarios that we saw before. And we want things to be interoperable. And to do this, you need that extensibility. You need the discoverability of it. So if you want to start getting out there and kicking the tires on SCIM a little bit, here's a good way to go about it. Dip your toes in a little bit. UnboundID, who's here at the conference, they've done a lot of work on SCIM. They've written part of the spec. They've been involved with developing tools for it. And they have a reference implementation server. And this is a really simple server that you can just fire up on your laptop. It starts a really basic in-memory server that has a SCIM interface on it. And you can hit that thing and get identities, get users back. If you're going to play with it, the kind of the ground zero easiest way is to use just some REST tools that are out there, curl or REST console. Curl is used often for testing REST APIs. It's just a command line utility to make HTTP requests. So here we're doing a get to grab Barbara Jensen. like we have been through curl. There's also a Chrome extension called REST Console that I like to use. There's a number of other tools out there that are similar to this, but if you want something that's a little more user-friendly and that's a little bit, if using a command line scares you, then avoid curl, use one of these things. It's an easy way to make some REST calls and just to play around with the SCIM API. So you've kicked the tires, you've played with curl, you've seen kind of what's out there, and you really want to start diving in. You want to write a SCIM client, or maybe you're a service provider and you want to write a SCIM server. Well, there's a lot of open source libraries out there to help you on your effort there. Most of them support SCIM 1.1. There's a whole slew of them that support SCIM 1.1. There's about 3 of them that are taking SCIM 2.0 spec and implementing that as that moves forward. For me, the one that I've played with the most and that I've seen kind of as the most full-featured, the most easy to develop against, and I'm a Java developer, is the UnboundID SCIM SDK. It has tools to help you create a SCIM client. It has tools to help you make a SCIM server. So it's got you covered on both ends. If you're into Python or Ruby, there's stuff out there for you. If you're into Java and Spring, there's some more out there for you. There's a number of these, and they're all listed on the simplecloud.info website. That should be sort of your starting point of where to go to that implementations, and you'll see a ton of them with the links of where to get info on how to use those. I'm going to focus a little bit on the UnboundID SDK because I like it so much. Like I said, it's full-featured. It does client and server, and they're now spending a lot of effort on trying to make it easier for users to develop against. So there's a check-in that's like less than a week old probably there about trying to make client development easier, trying to make the API simpler to use. So they're working towards that. Some work needs to go on to make the servers a little bit simpler. As an exercise, I prototyped a SCIM server using the UnboundID SDK, and it was nice. You can do everything you need to do, but there's some things that could be made simpler. So I created a library that makes this kind of simpler, extracted some of the common pieces. I'm calling it SCIM, but I don't want to hold on to it. I want to give it to the UnboundID guys, let them take it and run with it because it's not ready for prime time yet. But it actually cut down the lines of code by over 2/3 in the SCIM server that I created, and it does creates, deletes, listing, all that sort of stuff. Less than 300 lines of code. So really, if you use these open source tools, it's not hard to get going. And Mark Diodati can do it. I don't know if you'll know Mark, but he used to be an analyst at Gartner. He works for Ping now. And back when he was at Gartner, he wrote a SCIM program in Perl. And it was reading and writing to this Excel file, this craziest combination of things you could imagine, Perl and SCIM and REST and Excel. And so if Mark can do it, I'm here to tell you, you can do it. You can get there. So you might be saying, hold on a sec, I've already got a REST API. How does SCIM fit into this? So there's a couple options here if you already have a REST API. One option is just to say, okay, we're going to keep our normal REST API under one URL, and then we're going to put the SCIM REST API under a separate URL. And that gives you the benefit of keeping all the work that you've done already and having a standards-based interface to manage your identities, make your service easy to use in that respect. Option 2, like I was saying before, SCIM is extremely flexible and extensible. So if you're looking to go about creating a brand new API, you can look at using the UnboundID SDK or some of these tools to create your entire API doing this, create resource types for any object that's interesting to you, and go nuts with it. But it's important that people start doing these because we all saw what a spider web of connections we have in our enterprises these days. I'm getting questions all the time from prospects, from customers, Do you support SCIM? We're seeing it show up in RFCs. We're seeing it show up in kind of analyst reports and things like that. Do you support SCIM? So it's extremely important now. So the key takeaways here is that with the proliferation of identities and apps, we've had a lot of frustration. That SCIM is really the way forward to get past that. And here's your overall view of how to build a standards-based infrastructure. Use it for your environment. It's a good foundation for any REST API. And there's tools that you can use out there already. So go forth and conquer. Here's a bunch of resources. I'm going to share these slides also, so I'll put them up on SlideShare. You can get these references later, but this is kind of the page of where to start. Simplecloud.info can get you to most of these places. And thanks.